I want to welcome you again to another of our Institute Encounters, in which we have some extended conversation with the distinguished scholars who come to Texas Tech under the auspices of the Institute for the Study of Western Civilization. Today we have, as part of our four-part series, lecture series, Freedom, Text, and Context, Professor Gerard V. Bradley, who is a member of the faculty at the Law School of Notre Dame University, an authority on constitutional law and especially on constitutional law and public law more generally as it affects religious freedom. In 2012, Cambridge University Press published a book entitled Challenges to Religious Freedom, a book that needs a good deal of updating since there have been more challenges coming down the pike since it appeared, and no doubt will be a good many more in the future, alas. He's been talking about that to a variety of audiences here in Lubbock, but today, and of course you can see his talk, it will shortly be posted on our website, but today what I'd like to do is to talk about some other but related matters, and principally the place of Christianity and Christians in American higher education at this point near the beginning of the 21st century. What sort of challenges do Christians face trying to be Christians and at the same time function within whatever the accepted moral parameters are of their institution, deal with their colleagues, and of course pursue scholarship that may be motivated by Christian interests as well. So, Dr. Bradley, tell me a little bit about your own experience as a Christian in the field of law. Where does that put you within the general run of opinion within the profession of legal scholarship, and how have you met whatever challenges it raises?
Well, that's a good question, and I should begin by saying that my own scholarly specialty, which is religious liberty, puts me in contact with a great number of other scholars who themselves are believers in the legal academy, studying religious liberty, constitutional history thereof, contemporary challenges and controversies about religious liberty, is a growth industry. There's no shortage of critical questions to examine, and the history of our institutions and practices of religious liberty is also proved to be a very fertile field for scholarship. And many of the people with whom I interact there are themselves believers, some are not. But looking more generally than that at the legal academy, and starting first with the broader field of constitutional law, outside of my own specialty, there are few, and perhaps no other area in which I would dare say a preponderance of the participants in a scholarly debate are themselves believers, much less Christians. Constitutional law is important and a sort of bubbling field and a fertile field of scholarship. But few opportunities exist in it outside of select areas of civil liberties where you would say there's a distinctly Christian voice to be heard, or that there's a distinctly Christian voice speaking. Most of these important questions, in my own judgment, end up being resolved or depending only a little upon religious conviction. I think there are some areas of constitutional law beyond those involving freedom of religion where a religious perspective, maybe especially a Christian perspective, would be a welcome addition. For example, family law would be one. And criminal law, I think, as well. I think in the criminal law, the basic notions with which the criminal lawyer deals, guilt, freedom, choice, act, responsibility. I don't say or declare this to be the case as a matter of historical derivation, but I do think one could almost fully understand the very basics of our criminal law. And I mean I don't mean in that respect the content of the various statutes, but these notions of responsibility, excuse, justification, act, choice, intention, which are the stuff of criminal law, generally and foundationally, I think one could come to almost a full understanding of those notions, that nest of notions, by reading the Old Testament and the New Testament. Although that thought is one that I have not myself developed beyond a very preliminary study in my own work. And I think as a thought, while potentially fruitful, has not been pursued by others. We much more prefer to think that everything one needs to know or would want to know about criminal law can be found, if not in our own American experience, in the English experience shortly before the colonization of this continent.
Now, I know that there's a body of opinion in the Academy, and this probably is even more so in constitutional law, that argues that when it comes to making arguments about the public good, religion has no part. Religion is a private matter, not a public matter. It's really not open to kind of serious, rigorous discussion, and hence those points of view are kind of off base. Maybe you could tell us, am I right? And if so, how does that manifest itself?
Well, I do think that's very largely right,
Mm-hmm.
that religion is the kind of thing that has its proper place in private life, but that in public matters it's at best a kind of ineffectual add-on or an embellishment of arguments and conclusions that are based and should be based on other considerations. And religion may surprise some of the linguistic imagery for some of discussions of public life, so that in public affairs, arguments about equality will be carried forward on the basis of various considerations going back to political philosophy. But at the conclusion of a particular consideration of the matter, the author or speaker might say, well, that just shows that we are, after all God's children, or that we're all brothers and sisters. But it's really a rhetorical flourish and not a matter of substance. I think that what you describe as the situation is very largely right, in that those scholars in the law, let me speak just of the law for the moment, like myself, who tried to find more avenues of expression and who tried to colonize discussions about public matters with a more religious substance in bringing to bear religious substance, face a lot of pushback. There is an audience, there is a sympathetic audience for the introduction of more religious substance into these conversations, but I think that audience is limited and it would be a minority audience. I think that the wariness, if not hostility, to a greater role for religion in public life stems from two presuppositions, or if they're not presuppositions, 2 points of view or 2 considerations, one of which I think is entirely mistaken, and the other I think is partly mistaken. The one has to do with the nature of religion itself. The emergent view of religion is that while it has a place in private life, it has no real contribution to make to public life because of the kind of thing religion is, and that religion is a matter of imagination and emotion and experience. And when it comes to whatever cognitive element there is to religion, the cognitive element of religion is really just an attempt, fallible, always revisable attempt by human persons to thematize and to give expression to the raw and primordial stuff of religion, which again is emotion, feeling, and experience. And these could be, or typically are, feelings and experiences which are thought to be in connection with the divine. These could be feelings of utter dependence and creatureliness, or feelings of helplessness at the inscrutability and vastness of the universe. So these are, the cognitive element would consist, in this point of view, of attempts to give expression to these, let's call them feelings feelings and emotions. Now, if that's true, then it's not difficult to see that this would have little value added to offer to public debates. But I think that that's a very reductionist view of religion. No doubt religion includes feelings of dependence and perhaps loneliness and creatureliness. That's part of it. But I think religion is fundamentally not about those things. That religion, and the various religions, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, are all attempts to describe, now in humanly intelligible terms, but to describe what's real. I think religion is about reality. Now, it's about both visible and invisible reality, and it's about both human reality and divine reality. But I think religion is in the end about reality.
But it most intersects with law when it's about moral reality.
Correct. That's correct.
And if one is bringing religious belief to bear in an argument about the law, how does one do that in a community where, you know, people have different scripture, different revelation,
Right.
different notions of what doctrine is about right and wrong? How do you do that in that kind of situation?
Well, I think the best way to answer that question is to start with what you don't do. I think in not only in a pluralistic society like ours, but in any free society, I think it's inappropriate, or at least ineffectual, for believers to propose for adoption by lawmakers and policymakers a particular moral norm by dint of the authority of their religion. Now, however natural it may be for believers to speak this way, but insofar as, however natural it may be, believers offer up as a foundational component of some legal policy the fact that in the sacred book or in the hierarchical doctrine there is this authoritative pronouncement of a moral norm, and that the force of that moral norm depends, in truth, upon a prior acceptance of the authority of the book or the teacher. I think that is an inappropriate contribution to the public square, and likely to be, and frankly should be, ineffectual, since the whole force of the moral norm depends upon a prior shared acceptance of the authority. But that's not itself to exclude all recourse to religious concerns when it comes to morality, so that, for instance, just for instance, I myself think that all of the moral norms expressed in the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, are also accessible to reason, that their presence as part of religious teaching in both the Old and the New Testament does not in itself disqualify those moral norms for consideration in the public realm, precisely because I think they're also available to reason. So the coincidence or overlap between nature and revelation, or reason and revelation, is itself a common feature of religious moral norms, and I think that coincidence ought not to be remarkable in a society like ours in which many people are religious. I think also a second way in which even the fact that the great religions, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, have taught in many respects the same moral norms, not in all respects, but in many respects, and that these have been the norms, especially with Judeo-Christian norms, of the American people for centuries. Now that fact will, I think, function as at least a minor premise in many policy-making arguments. I mean, again, the fact that the American people have adhered to the Decalogue by itself doesn't make the Decalogue true, and the fact that people adhere to the Decalogue doesn't even make the Decalogue more likely true than not true. But I do think the fact that it has been the common morality of the American people has its place in serious reflection upon what the law should be. As the common possession of the American people, as a moral framework which has united and structured their cooperation for the common good, and that these are moral norms which are held dear by a great number of people. And that fact about our community is something that lawmakers ought to consider. Again, not as a source of normativity, but as a very important piece of information about the community for which they are legislating.
Well, if it's true that one through reason can reach moral conclusions that are in accord with the Decalogue and other basic principles of faith, golden rule, something of that sort, and if it's true that one can at least buttress one's argument as to the feasibility of doing something by referring to the Judeo-Christian nature of American morality, where does religion per se come in to the argument? One would seem to be an exercise in philosophy, and the other would seem to be an exercise in sociology or historical sociology. Where does religion itself come in?
Well, I think it's fair to say it comes into play as a matter of fact and as a coincident source of normativity, but it also comes into play in the following way. Believers, even those who hold to these norms on the basis of authority, will hold them as true. And adherence to the Decalogue, I think typically or characteristically, hold the norms perhaps on the basis of authority or authoritative accounts of the deliverance of them to Moses, but they hold them nonetheless as true. So you're dealing then with the moral norms that a very large number of people in this political community hold as true. And therefore, the dependence of some of our criminal laws and the partial dependence of some of our other laws upon these moral truths, however accessible to reason, that dependence, coupled with the fact that many, many people adhere to them as true religious norms, I think that fact that people hold them as true by virtue of religious authority, is sort of a pearl of great price. That is to say that a criminal law can build upon these norms, although accessible to reason, precisely because the community holds them as true, not just as rules for a particular congregation of people, but as truths, really, in a way, of human nature and truths of justice. So I do think that their status as religious truths, to put it simply, is a fact of sort of almost unsurpassable importance to the lawmaker. Even a lawmaker who himself or herself does not personally hold these norms as morally true by virtue of religion.
Well, what then happens in a society, and it seems to be the direction ours is heading, in which a consensus over basic morality has broken down? And now you've talked publicly about consequences for religious believers and freedom of conscience, but what about the larger consequences for policymakers? If you don't have that foundation on which we once confidently built, what's likely to come next?
Well, we'll see. But I do think a society which, as you're suggesting or hypothesizing, and I would take up the suggestion and make it my own, that our society has experienced a loss of consensus on basic moral norms. I think that society is in a distressed situation. I think that society is hobbled. I think that some of the constituent elements of any political common good will be understandings about what is genuinely good for people. So to put the matter in a slightly different set of terms, but I think I'm trying to talk about the same thing, to say that there's a breakdown of consensus about moral norms, I think, is to say at least partly, and maybe almost entirely, that there's no longer consensus on what the basic components of human good are and human flourishing are. And once that comes into view, then it becomes difficult to imagine exactly how there can be a genuine shared common good. Not that there aren't other elements to common good in a political community. For instance, common resources and common edifices. So common natural resources, common amenities like courts and armies and laws. That's all part of the common good. But perhaps at the foundation of the political common good is some set of common goods, common, agreed upon elements of genuine human flourishing. And when that's lost or obscured or even disrupted, I think that society suffers. Now, one consequence, you asked, well, what next? I think one consequence in a society of that sort is already a conception of public and private life that is upon us, maybe not enveloped us, but already elements of it are already visible in our understanding of our social world, where you might say we've privatized not only religion, but as Alistair McIntyre first said some years ago, we've also privatized the good. In public, we talk about common interests, common projects, common threats, common needs. But in public, we tend not to talk about the common good. So we've unfortunately privatized religion and the good. And in public, we're putting enormous stress or asking considerations of interest and need to bear enormous stress. And I think one consequence of all of that is that there becomes there's a kind of fragility. At the same time, there's a certain power in being law-abiding. And let me, if I could explain that just a bit more. At the same time that in a society which has lost agreement about the nature of the common good, or at least no longer agrees on what common goods are, or which are common goods, That's a society that will operate, I think, more and more on a more or less stable consensus about what needs to be done. A more or less stable, articulable, common view about what our challenges and needs are. It won't be much informed by a common account of what constitutes human flourishing, which account flourishes, you might say, in many forms, in a variety of diverse forms in private life. So I think in a society like ours, or the one which we're becoming, there's a heightened premium on observing the law come what may, because the positive law becomes the sinew of our common life. No longer is a set of common understandings or a common conception of the good life, or even in some senses common courtesy. There's less respect now for our common history and for our civic unity as a people. So that I think in a society where there's this great pluralism or degradation even in an understanding of human flourishing, that law-abidingness becomes prized as never before, and suggestions that in public life persons ought to be pursuing the extension of their own religious or moral understandings into public affairs, those suggestions become at least possibly or potentially menaces to public peace.
So you think it may be possible for a society to continue for an indefinite period on the grounds of fidelity to the law without any sense of that law being anchored in something deeper that most respect?
I think so. I think a society which doesn't face mortal external threats from a political enemy or a true national catastrophe of natural causes, per se. I think a society of that sort, freed from these calamities, can continue to function, if not indefinitely, for quite a long time, without a consensus underneath its political and legal institutions. Which is not to say everything's fine. So, but I think that society suffers greatly.
Has there been a society like that?
Well, my guess would be that there are some Western European societies are close to this, where a common ethnic and political heritage has been eclipsed by, well, not only membership in the EU, but by migration and a kind of conscious cultivation of pluralism and a national identity that has no deep identity to it. There might be some Western European countries that are like this. Canada might be like this, where there isn't too much to be said by way of being a Canadian, nor is there a widespread consensus about what's good. But I think societies favored by fortune and preserved from mortal threats of various sorts, and perhaps in addition to that, with more or less unacknowledged, but nonetheless powerful efforts to assimilate and acculturate people, whether it's through public schooling or by constant sermonizing about the need to observe the law. So I think there can be a great deal of political conditioning in societies of this sort. But what I do think will be lost, and the loss will grow as time passes, is the opportunity for people to genuinely flourish, because to a significant extent, genuine flourishing, I think, does depend upon supportive political, legal, and cultural institutions. I think in private life, people aren't in a position to sort of choose their own culture. They certainly don't choose their own law. So there is some extent, I think a significant extent, to which living a good life depends upon the law supporting a wholesome and sort of helpful culture. And if the law does not do that, then people's opportunities to live good lives suffers. The other thing that's lost, and this is especially lost to persons who are Christians, and it might well be true for persons who are Jewish and belong to other traditions, but let me just speak from my own knowledge of the Christian tradition. To be a believing Christian, but to do that and limit it to being limit to private life, is simply to have a Christianity that's decapitated or hobbled in some way. That to truly be a Christian involves being a Christian both in private and public life. It doesn't mean grabbing the opportunity in public life to sermonize at everybody or to try to convert people, but rather Christians are Christians 24/7. And there isn't any way, I think, for a Christian to participate in public life while not being Christian. So that as this drama unfolds, a society being carried forward by fidelity to law, more or less stable consensus on an agenda, and on a prosperity. That is to say, if a society is succeeding economically and people are enjoying the good life that that offers, that society can continue operating. But I think that in public life, in that place, there'll be a requirement of strict conformity to what the law says you should do. And that'll may be very difficult for Christians to abide day in and day out. So just to the extent that being a Christian involves being a Christian in public life, there's a threat of diminishing the possibility for a Christian life by so separating public life from the wellsprings of morality and faith.
And one might argue that the situation that we're facing in our universities particularly, and at the level of elite culture, and presumably that after a while seeps into other levels as well, is, well, in part a greater degree of fragmentation, but also in part perhaps a building moral consensus of a new kind. A consensus that argues the most important thing in life is self-realization. That self-realization can take us in a variety of directions, but that certainly self-realization through the senses is, if not at the heart, certainly a critically important part of what it means to be alive. And so the old notions of behavioral restraint, the whole notion of a kind of internalized self-discipline, the Decalogue itself is not just now one of many different options for people, but something that flies in the face of the new normality. And I would think, in terms of university culture, and it was once thought that, the university didn't particularly espouse a way of life beyond that involved in the search for knowledge in a serious and rigorous manner. But I don't think that can be said anymore. I think if you look at our universities, they are very dedicated to propagating a notion of human flourishing that's at odds with traditional Christian and other traditional ethoses, kind of worldviews. What is it then like for a Christian to be a citizen of one of those institutions in which you are asked to participate in things that may reflect this kind of antithetical moral sensibility? What sort of experience are Christian scholars having in that respect?
Well, I think the way you describe the modern university, well, certainly the modern research university, is quite accurate. It's probably helpful to put aside explicitly, more than a handful of smaller, mostly liberal arts colleges. Many of them are religious institutions where life on campus would be substantially different than it is at modern research institutions, both public and private, and in the private sphere of the modern research university, both religious and non-religious private universities. I think actually the modern research university in America, whether it's public, private, religious or not, is much more in common. All of those types of institutions have much more in common than they do differences. And I do think that in those places, it is not, again, as you describe it, a matter of largely prescinding from wider arguments about the overall good life, which the research university up until 30 or 40 years ago might have left safely in the hands of family and the churches and Newman societies that were surrounding the campus. But now they may have in those days, taken up, as you say, the virtues of the life of the mind, and that there were norms on campus, but they were usually norms of inquiry and truth-telling and honesty and integrity and intellectual matters. I do think it's changed. I do think that you have now on campuses of the type I'm describing, the research university campus, a new orthodoxy. It's an emaciated one, an impoverished one, but it is an orthodoxy. It's an orthodoxy about self-realization and authenticity in activities, especially in private activities, so-called like sexuality, but across the board. It's a matter of self-realization and self-actualization. And once one that, and that's not just a matter of there being some implications of that sort for any person who is the author of his or her own life. Although I think it's true that to say each person should be the author of his or her own life and be a self-directing agent, I would say, of course, a corollary effect or an implication of that is that persons are, you might say, self-actualizing. But that's a different set of claims. We're talking now instead, as you suggest, of self-actualization as itself the paramount moral norm, not the implications of something else, but the paramount moral norm. And once that becomes the paramount moral norm, then all other moral norms, such as those in the Decalogue, become mere rules. They can't possibly be moral truths because there is a paramount moral truth which is at odds with those. So they're reduced to the status of rules, or rules of thumb, which by definition are no longer binding on everyone, but only on some people, so that those rules become, and for those for whom they don't quite apply or would impede self-actualization, they become irksome intrusions. So to finally get around to your question about what about the professor, I happen to be at a Christian or Catholic university, but it is a research university. I dare say the situation on campus for Catholic professors such as myself is better at Notre Dame than it would be at most of the other modern research universities, both public and private. But Notre Dame is not immune to the temptations or the siren call of this actualizing self. And there are limitations even at Notre Dame for a Catholic professor and what one can express without at least becoming aware of possible penalties, recriminations, or at least negative feedback. But at Notre Dame, and speaking for myself as a Catholic, I am aware of the fact that many of my students, probably most of them, have drunk all too deeply from this fountain of self-actualization, and that fact, which I think would be irresponsible to deny or obscure or ignore, causes me to understand that although I've been teaching at this Catholic university for 24 years, and the percentage of Catholics in the undergraduate population and even in the law school population is quite high, I'm actually in a position more of evangelizing persons. That is, not evangelizing in the sense of trying to convert them, but rather as presenting almost anew to these people the possibility that these irksome moral norms or moral rules could actually be truths about human flourishing. So that's one effect for me. A second effect would be an awareness, as I say, of the possibility, and in some cases the actuality, of being considered a bad citizen of the university for speaking out quite as candidly as I do about some of the issues, including same-sex marriage. But especially in the classroom, I'm keenly aware of the fact that I'm not, and I teach law, I don't teach morality as such, and I don't teach religion, but in my capacity as a professor of constitutional law and civil liberties, many of the cases we look at, including most recently the same-sex marriage case, it's impossible to teach that, as I did last week, without considering the question of what is marriage? Is there such a thing as marriage? If there is such a thing as marriage, apart from whatever the law says it is, what is the nature of this natural thing, this natural institution? So that's an example of what I mean when I say I can't help but teach what I teach without engaging in this, not an argument, but rather without encountering the effects of this moral degradation or corruption. And I am aware of the fact when I teach that my situation is of one who is presenting rather than assuming the presence of commitments, that there'll be a lot of pushback from students about the nature of marriage or the nature of religion or about the ethics of killing and abortion or in the death penalty. And I try to teach effectively and reach all the students without buying into, if you will, their own relativism and subjectivism. So trying to reach them, and my situation is far from unique, but it is the challenge perhaps of the Christian professor in the academy today, which is to try to find a way to connect and engage with students, most of whom are either ignorant or have rejected the foundations of the moral life, or both.
What do your colleagues think of that? Do they feel that, do they think that they're citizens of a different academic republic than you?
I think, speaking only of my law school
Mhm.
colleagues, I think quite a few of them, many of them, share my misgivings or my regrets or my perspective. Now, most of them don't have the particular challenge that I have because they teach corporate law or federal income tax or many other areas of law. They won't, in a sense, run up against the effects of this moral corruption or moral disarmament or moral meltdown the way I do. And not in the slightest way suggesting that their teaching is anything less than it ought to be. But if you're teaching trial techniques or how to take a deposition or how to engage in a certain commercial transaction, surely at the edges there are considerations of not only civility but of rectitude and justice. But they would be at the edges, whereas much of what I teach, those considerations of rectitude and justice are in the middle of the picture.
To what extent you've been president of the Fraternity of Catholic Scholars?
A fellowship of Catholic
Fellowship
Scholars.
of Catholic Scholars. Now that's not, I gather, an organization that sort of plays an activist role on campus.
Correct.
Are there communities made up of faithful people that direct their activities to changing the campus culture in which faculty, rather than just students, would be involved?
I don't think so. There are, in the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars was not particularly about law professors, and actually very few law professors were members. They were mostly other professors of other liberal arts, and our activities were limited to mutual encouragement and support, but also, to the extent it went beyond the kind of the well-being of the members of the group, had to do with the well-being of Catholic colleges and universities in America. But as to whether there are groups of Christian professors who are, keen to do whatever they can to make for a more healthy academic culture on the American campuses writ large, there are some associations of like-minded, and the ones I can think of at least, would be Christian professors who have listservs and are in kind of regular communication about what it's like to be an historian of religion who's Christian. There is some fellowship among these more informal groups. There are in several disciplines and that I know of, and probably in several cases that I'm not personally aware of, these like-minded groups of persons who are trading ideas and meeting occasionally perhaps as an adjunct to their professional meetings. So I'm just supposing at this point that the American Sociological Association meeting, which draws thousands, may have a 3-hour affair either before or after, which 200 or so Christian professors get together. But that's about as far as it goes. The group which you founded and so frankly magnificently headed for so many years, the National Association of Scholars, is the most important group of this general sort that I can think of. Not because the NAS was itself a faith-minded group, but I should say that the NAS and any other groups with the same mission contribute mightily to the revitalization of the campuses in a revitalization that's harmonious with, and indeed actually promotes the revitalization that these Christian professors promote. Because I do think that what the NAS stands for, is in a way fundamentally what these groups are trying to stand for. Because I think at this point, because of forces of political correctness, the decay in the culture, and the indifference of so many students who have been brought up on social media, I think that associations of professors, I'll say, of more classical or traditional points of view concerning learning and what the academy is supposed to be. So persons, whether faithful or not, whatever the group happens to be, who are committed to opening minds to the possibility of truth, and who are requiring, if they can, their students to take seriously and honestly and confront honestly and without blinkers arguments and evidence, and to believe in the capacity of the human mind to work through arguments and evidence and arrive at conclusions amply supported, conclusions to be held, and not to avoid conclusions because, well, who's to say what's right or wrong? So I think any group, including the NAS especially, which is committed to a kind of non-relativism in campus inquiry, and is committed to what I call the more traditional canons of academic life, contributes just by doing that to the revitalization of these campuses that these Christian professors that we've been talking about also are trying to affect. I think there's not only a harmony of purpose there, but really a true convergence of purpose.
Well, you know, the battle, as it often appears, to me at least on campuses, is between groups of people, sometimes having strong moral convictions, but who are first and foremost educators. And as educators who approach their tasks in the manner you just described, they want to, if they're going to bring people to the positions they themselves have reached, they want to do it through a rational process. They want to hone their critical thinking skills in a true sense by having them applied to really important issues in which the various dimensions are examined, in which emotional appeals are avoided, and in which, you know, one tries to tell truth in a way that befits an occupant of the temple of reason. And on the other side, you have people who are absolutely convinced of the truth of what they believe, but who don't feel the same compunctions. They don't see themselves so much as educators as they do agents of social change. And they come to the campus not caring quite so scrupulously about how they bring about change, but caring very much about the end itself. If that's an accurate description of a great many places in American academia today, what do people who still think of themselves in that older sense of using the instruments of reason to explore ideas, in some faith that exploration will lead to a real truth that's out there to be found, how in this sort of asymmetrical combat do people like that, can they hope to succeed? Do they need to do anything other than they're now doing? Are they kind of at the mercy of the less scrupulous? Should they try to change the rules of the game in some way? What should they do?
Well, I think that they can take some hope. There's grounds for hope. But I do think, and there can be victories, I do think that the professors about which we're speaking, who believe in the possibility of truth, but who aren't egotistical and vain, so far as I agree with what you're saying. I would say it by saying that a professor who's looking for echoes and acolytes can't be a true educator. In a way, it's edifying if one turns out to have an acolyte, or let's say a more dignified way, if one begins to develop a bit of a following and even realizes that students wish you to be a mentor to them. That certainly can be edifying, and I think is edifying, but not at the expense of their critical faculties and their independence of judgment. So, and there are more than a few vain professors. Now, some of them are the agents of social change. That is to say, the professors just want the students to come to the conclusions that the professors want them to come to, and nothing else really matters. And now that may have the patina of commitment to the betterment of humankind, but I think that it has some of that. But I think there's a big element of vanity and egotism there. But they're not educators. They're recruiters, they're indoctrinators, they're propagandists, but they're not educators. But I think true educators also have to face off, have to take account of the fact that they're in a minority. I don't think true educators are necessarily outnumbered by the social justice people, although they probably are. I think the greater threat on campus that I see today is the professors who simply have lost the courage to challenge fundamentally lazy students. I mean students who simply want to take shortcuts. The students who have, you might say, the other professors' view of learning. I mean the students who want to just produce the requisite output. And the students don't want to go through the trouble of actually thinking and learning, debating within themselves and with each other, and arriving at conclusions after the hard work of deliberation, consideration, and judgment. So that student, I say lazy, or I say the sort of output-oriented, it's that student, I think, is the greatest challenge to the real educator today. The student, in a way, who's all too willing to be an echo or an acolyte, or at least simply to try to do as little as possible, but give the professor what he or she wants. So I think that the true educator faces that's the steep uphill climb, is to challenge students, to make them work for themselves, work to educate themselves. And I think there are victories, but they have to be measured, I think, in the proper quantities or according to the right metrics. There are liable to be small victories. Students will push back against a true educator. I think one will probably have to accept a certain measure of unpopularity among students, that the word on the student street will be that this professor that we're talking about, the true educator, works students too hard, leaves too many loose ends, doesn't answer all of our questions. I think you have to accept that that's the price of being a true educator. And I think one has to expect that the educational leadership, that is the administrators on campus, will much more often than not side with the lazy student, side with not challenging them, side with giving the students more of what they want and less of what they need. I think that's the second great challenge besides the student, is that the administrators will not usually encourage the true educator. Again, putting aside some smaller liberal arts colleges, and perhaps putting aside some departments, particular departments, probably not whole colleges, but perhaps even some colleges on these major university campuses. But for the vast run of those people who want to be true educators, I think the negative feedback has to be accepted as a cost of doing business. It's like paying taxes. And then I think one just counts as victories those students whom they really enliven, illuminate, and sort of make sit up and take the intellectual life seriously. And will, I think, cherish the friendship eventually of these persons. They will remember that true educator professor as the one who stood out, as the one who made them really work and think. I think that's true. I think that I've taught law for 33 years now, and I can't say I have a large number of acolytes. I don't think that's the case at all. But I do hear regularly from students, occasionally from students I've actually forgotten, but who will remember that on a certain day, or with regard even to a particular discussion, that I made them think, and that they've always remembered that. And now, these years later, they want to say, maybe in the course of a conversation or email exchange about something else, they'll say, by the way, I really want to say. And that's the great reward, I think. And there'll be some such occasions for the true educator.
So you're less concerned about the zealous faculty member than you are the lazy student.
And the faculty member who surrenders to the lazy students.
And his administrative abettor out there. Is there therefore, to have a sense of educational vocation, it seems to me that you do need to believe that there's a truth out there, and you do need to be a morally empowered person. And while you don't necessarily have to be religious, certainly being religious, being Christian, should help. Mm-hmm. You mentioned the administrators as the abettors. We don't have as many Christian scholars as we should. Do we have a lot of Christian administrators?
I think not. Those who want to really lead in the cause of true education probably find their ways to the smaller colleges. My observation, it's not an expert one. It's not the product of study, but rather of experience of 33 years. I've encountered many good Christian people in positions of educational leadership that is in charge of various functions, all the way up to the top of private universities. But again, leaving aside smaller Christian colleges, for example. I think the pressures of the job, the prerequisites of the job, what their functions are, make it almost impossible to genuinely lead at all. So I think one rises to the top of the educational food chain so that one becomes a candidate to be president of one of the universities by basically being a company man, to be candid. That's the way you rise up. And then when you get to the top, if you secure such a job, I think that trying to, and here I say this with some sympathy for the plight of these persons, but to basically keep one of these huge operations, multi-million, even multi-billion, if you include the endowment, operations going, with the vast networks of constituents that are involved, attracting enough students, recruiting the good faculty, keeping the good faculty, keeping the alums happy, bringing in the millions, if not billions of dollars, and all of that involves, dealing with the accrediting associations, with government regulation, with Title IX requirements. I think it's really, in a way, admirable to do the job at all without the thing falling apart. And to do it well is rare, but I do think that the dean, provost, and president of today, in my observation, is more of a middle to upper management person than a true leader. I think that, not to say that people aren't more or less effective in those jobs, and people can do better or worse jobs, but I think the nature of the job makes it a managerial position. It's a matter of managing conflict, looking to avoid conflict, trying to keep everybody somehow happy, no matter what their station is at the university, and raising a great deal of money. I don't think that that's a position in which people can exercise leadership. I think the cost, the possibility of someone being today both president of one of the major research universities, of which in America perhaps there are only a couple of hundred perhaps, and there are many smaller universities with more or less of a commitment to research, but it's the idea of being a president of one of these places, but actually being a true innovator and leader, and even emerging from, or while occupying a chair of one of these positions, becoming what university presidents used to be, with public intellectuals, often of the first rank, and important persons in our political culture. I don't think you see that, because not only are those distractions, they're roles that might invite controversy. I mean, to put it bluntly, and just a bit unfairly, if a university president became known for standing for something substantive, it might cause trouble with the smooth functioning of the university. So educational leaders, I think, can find their place, but they're going to be in smaller places, places that have a more distinct mission, in a sort of fuller and more confident sense of what they're about, and institutions that are a bit not indifferent to, but kind of insulated from these pressures of peers, the big rankings, competition for the best and highest ranking, highest scoring SAT students. They don't need to raise $1 billion next year. There, I think you have the freedom to actually lead.
So it would seem, if that's true, what you'd expect of these larger institutions is that whatever the zeitgeist was of the society in which they're situated, that's likely to be theirs, because there's no one in a leading position who really has time to think of much of anything else.
Right, and I think that the first rule of thumb for a university president is try not to rock the boat. And if there's going to be change, it has to be incremental change. And even then it has to be incremental change that nobody seriously objects to. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I mean, the Modern Research University, I really think is just so fully ensconced, not within, as it used to be, perhaps a kind of intellectual world, but actually fully ensconced within the political, economic, commercial structure of the society, that it's as these institutions go, so go America. So it's like being the head of a huge modern corporation, and to think of being an educational innovator while heading a huge modern corporation becomes almost impossible to imagine.
So if it's going to come from anywhere, it's going to come from the faculty?
I think there's a possibility of it coming from the faculty, but the faculty, I think, becomes so balkanized in the Modern Research University, because of the pressures that they're under to produce certain kinds of research and produce a certain quantity of research, and their loyalty and dedication to their own cohort of researchers, those at other institutions with whom they're in constant contact by email, so that their own. I observe that the reference points for the very good faculty, even at the Modern Research University, the reference point is usually their own discipline, and I observe that even very accomplished scholars and persons were accomplished scholars with character. But their reference point is less and less the university at which they're physically located and from which they draw their paycheck. You know, their world is just the world outside of the university. So it's not a case of the faculty's not minding the store at all. But I think the faculty is really ceding authority and control over the life of their own campus, you know, to the professional administrators. And I observe that that's the developing and emerging, already emergent division of labor. The faculty are well compensated and supported in their research, and they're provided a kind of congenial work environment. And in return, at least the implicit bargain is, leave the running of the university to the professionals, which would be the administrators, not the faculty.
But that doesn't include the curriculum.
No, faculty, I think in general, the faculty retain control of the curriculum, but they have nothing to say about resources. So even curricular change or curricular stasis, if it's a choice to maintain the curriculum, you know, can be undermined by allocation of resources. But I think that, you know, the two functions where faculties remain not only important players, but probably indispensable and even lead players, are hiring of their colleagues to research and teaching positions, regular faculty positions, and over what they teach. And that's all to be, we're all grateful for that. There's a proliferation, of course, of irregular teachers, adjuncts, and other part-time people. Those choices are made usually with little consultation with the faculty, perhaps none, but little at best. They're temporary appointments, occasional appointments, and the deans and the professionals handle those. And curricular change, I think, is in the hands of the faculty. My observation would be that although finally perhaps impossible to affect important curricular change without the consent of the faculty, I think administrators, perhaps with an eye on the student market and student tastes and the prospects for student employment and the economy after college, administrators will work in a way that wasn't common 30 years ago to see to it that the faculty makes the right choices.
So it would seem, you know, the university in its origins in the Western world was a religious institution, was
Correct.
a Christian institution. And almost without exception, the early colleges and universities in the United States were that as well.
Correct.
So it strikes me that, you know, you're describing a sea change, not with respect just to size and complexity, or even the extent to which universities are subject to outside regulation, but the whole sense of purpose.
Yeah.
That there's no longer this religious or moral vocation, except insofar as faculty members on their own, in structuring the curriculum and teaching their courses, decide to infuse it with something. Is that coming from the institution?
I think it's very largely true. Yes.
So, to the extent that there's going to be a traditional ethos in our universities, something that remains rooted in our Christian or Judeo-Christian past, it's really up to people like yourself to not only in their individual capacity as teachers, but in their role as academic citizens, to self-consciously fight these fights.
Agreed.
So really what you've done here is show us how there's a great need for more Gerard Bradleys.
Well, I don't know about that. I wouldn't go that far, Steve Balch, but I would say that there is a great need for more and more persons who are willing to be real educators, and you know more about that than I do. You've taught at undergraduate and graduate level. But we need more true educators, but the only kind of true educator who will enter the academy and remain a true educator would be someone, I think, who has a very finely developed and deep sense of purpose as a professor. That may be the kind of sense of oneself and one's calling that is most commonly going to occur with persons who have religious convictions, who are sustained in season and out of season, by a conviction about not only the worthwhileness of what they're doing, but also the worthwhileness, you might say, of their doing it. That there's a kind of calling to this, the strength of the calling, and you might even say the rewards of the calling, don't depend entirely upon worldly success. That one feels as if there's there's a call that one is responding to that has its sources beyond the here and now. But it doesn't mean that one has to be religious to have this deep sense of calling. And I know faculty members at Notre Dame who are not religious, but who have an incredible dedication to what I consider to be true education. But yes, it may well be that, as a statistical matter at least, the normal situation for a true educator to emerge and to have the wherewithal to see it through for an entire career, despite the probable setbacks and frustrations, that person is very likely to have a religious basis to their sense of vocation.
Well,
and if they do, good for them.
I think you are a true educator. I think we do need more Gerard Bradleys, and I want to thank you for being with us this afternoon.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.